I had planned the trip for weeks. I wanted something difficult, something that would take me far away from traffic, screens, and the usual noise of daily life. I chose a trail that I had only read about in old guidebooks. It wasn't popular anymore, partly because new routes had opened nearby that were easier and more scenic, but also because this one had a reputation for being too long, too rugged, and poorly marked. That was exactly what I wanted. I thought I was ready. I started early in the morning. The air was cool, the sun still low. My backpack felt heavy on my shoulders, but in a good way, like it was full of everything I would need. Water, food, a sleeping bag, a small stove, and a map I had printed out at home. I felt strong and confident, almost excited. I had hiked many times before, but this one felt different. It was supposed to be 2 days out and 2 days back, with no real campgrounds, only flat spots where people sometimes stopped. The trail began smooth, wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. I moved quickly, stepping over roots, listening to the sound of birds waking up, the crunch of dirt under my boots. My breathing was steady, my body warmed fast. I remember feeling proud, even smug, like this was going to be easy. That confidence started to fade after the first few hours. The trail narrowed and grew steeper. It climbed through thick trees that blocked the sun, making the air damp and heavy. The map in my pocket felt less useful each time I looked at it. The landmarks drawn on the paper never seemed to match what I saw. I tried to keep moving, telling myself I could always retrace my steps if I got confused. By noon, I was sweating hard. My shirt clung to my back, and every step felt heavier than the one before. The trail seemed endless, winding up and down, never straight, always teasing me with false ridges that looked like the top but weren't. My legs burned. My boots rubbed against my heels. I kept drinking water, but it only made me more aware of how far I still had to go. When I finally stopped to rest, I noticed how quiet it was. Not just quiet in the normal way forests are, but heavy quiet like the trees were pressing down on me. The air had a weight to it. I sat on a rock, chewing a piece of jerky, staring at the dirt. That was when I realized I hadn't seen a single person all morning. Not one. No hikers, no campers, no distant voices. Just me. The trail markers grew harder to spot after that. Some were faded paint on tree trunks. Others were small piles of stones that could easily be mistaken for random shapes in the woods. I had to keep stopping to scan the area, sometimes walking in short circles to find the next sign. Each time it took longer. My stomach twisted with worry, but I told myself to stay calm. I still had hours of daylight left. By late afternoon, the forest opened into a clearing with tall grass. My legs shook as I dropped my pack and let myself fall onto the ground. My whole body ached. I forced myself to eat, even though I didn't feel hungry. The guidebook had mentioned a stream near the halfway point, and I needed it badly. My bottles were nearly empty. I searched for the sound of water, but all I heard was the wind moving through the grass. I decided to push forward, even though I was tired. That was my first real mistake. Instead of stopping to rest for the night, I convinced myself I could reach the stream before dark. I strapped my pack back on and kept walking. The trail twisted through thicker woods, darker than before. The sun dropped fast, the sky turning orange then gray. I couldn't hear anything but my own breathing. I kept telling myself the stream had to be close, maybe just beyond the next turn. But each time it wasn't. When darkness finally hit, I was still walking. My flashlight shook in my hand, the beam bouncing off trunks and roots. The air grew colder. My breath came out in clouds. I told myself I had to stop, so I found a flat spot beside the trail, cleared some rocks, and laid out my sleeping bag. I was too tired to cook. I slid inside the bag and stared at the blackness above me. Couldn't sleep. My body wanted rest, but my mind wouldn't shut off. Every sound in the woods made my chest tighten. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of some animal I didn't recognize. I kept imagining figures standing just beyond the light of my flashlight. I turned it off to save the batteries, but that made it worse. The darkness felt alive, pressing against me, waiting. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke shivering. My bag was damp from the dew, my clothes sticking to my skin. I sat up and felt dizzy, my stomach sour. The night wasn't over yet, but I couldn't lie there anymore. I packed quickly, my fingers numb, and started walking again even though it was still pitch black. Hours passed in a blur. My legs felt stiff, my shoulders raw from the straps. When the first gray light appeared through the trees, I nearly cried with relief. But the relief didn't last long. The trail looked different in the daylight, and not in a good way. It didn't match the map anymore. The turns and rises were wrong. I stopped, checked the compass, and realized with a sinking feeling that I had veered off at some point during the night. I wasn't where I thought I was. Panic bubbled in my chest. My water was gone. My food was low. The map was useless now. Nothing around me looked familiar. I forced myself to breathe slowly. I told myself the trail had to reconnect somewhere. I just had to keep moving. So I picked a direction and followed it. That was the start of the worst day of my life. The woods seemed endless. My feet blistered. My mouth dried until my tongue stuck to my teeth. Every step was slower than the last. I found no stream, no clearing, no sign of anyone. The sun climbed high, baking the ground. I stumbled often, catching myself on trees, scraping my arms and hands. My head pounded with each heartbeat. At one point, I thought I heard water. I dropped my pack and ran toward the sound, crashing through brush, falling to my knees in the dirt. But when I reached it, it was only wind through rocks. The disappointment hit so hard I nearly cried. By afternoon, I was weak. My vision blurred. I tried to eat a piece of jerky, but I couldn't chew. My throat was too dry. I licked the condensation from leaves, scooped handfuls of dirt hoping for hidden moisture. It wasn't enough. The sun began to sink again, and I realized I might not make it another night. My chest tightened with fear, not just fear of being lost, but fear of what my body was already doing to me. My muscles trembled without control. My mind drifted in and out, like I was falling asleep even as I walked. Then I saw it, a thin line of dirt, different from the ground around it. At first I thought I was imagining it, but as I followed it, it widened. Path. Not the same trail I had started on, but a path. My legs carried me forward even though they felt like breaking. The path led downhill. The trees grew thinner. I stumbled, slid, almost fell several times. And then, through the trees, I saw something I never thought I would see again. A gravel road. I don't remember falling, but I remember the feel of rocks against my cheek. I lay there for a long time, barely able to move, until I heard the faint sound of an engine. I forced myself up, waved my arms weakly, and collapsed again. The next thing I remember is waking in a hospital bed. My throat was raw, my lips cracked, my body sore in every place. A doctor explained I had been found by a driver who almost didn't see me on the side of the road. I had severe dehydration, heat exhaustion, and bruises all over. But I was alive. That hike taught me more than anything else ever has. I learned how fragile the body can be when you take nature lightly. I learned how quickly confidence can turn into desperation. And I learned that sometimes survival is not about strength or skill, but about the small chance of being in the right place at the right time. I never finished the trail. I never went back. To this day, even years later, I can still feel that crushing silence, that endless dark, and the sharp taste of fear in the back of my throat. I went into those woods thinking I would conquer them. Instead, they stripped me down to nothing, left me broken on the side of a road, and forced me to understand what it really means to be lost. And that was the end of it. I lived, but only barely. I have always loved hiking. I liked the feeling of being away from towns and roads, away from people and noise. The quiet of the woods always gave me a kind of peace. I liked the sound of my boots hitting the dirt, the smell of pine and wet earth, and the simple rhythm of moving forward. It was a way for me to clear my mind. I had done dozens of trails before, some short day hikes and some that stretched into long weekends. But the one I am about to tell you about is the one that changed how I see hiking forever. It started on a Saturday in early fall. The mornings were getting cooler, but the afternoons were still warm. The leaves had only just begun to change, so most of the forest was still green, with some bright spots of yellow and red breaking through. I had picked a trail I had never done before. It was about 12 miles long, a loop that went through thick forest, up over a ridge, and back down along a river. The guidebook described it as moderate to challenging, which was usually my favorite kind. Long enough to feel like an adventure, but not so dangerous that it required ropes or special gear. I set out early in the morning with a small backpack. I packed water, a few protein bars, a flashlight, a map, and a small first aid kit. I wasn't planning to camp overnight. I just wanted a good long day out in the woods. The trailhead was about an hour's drive from where I lived. By the time I parked and laced up my boots, the sun was fully up. The air was cool, and there was a thin layer of mist over the ground. The first few miles were easy. The path was wide, and I could hear birds calling in the trees. Squirrels darted across the ground, and I saw deer tracks in the mud. I was enjoying myself. I stopped once to take a drink of water and check the map. Everything seemed fine. As the trail began to climb toward the ridge, it got narrower and rockier. The forest was denser there. Tall trees blocked out much of the sunlight, and the air felt cooler. The path was scattered with roots, and I had to watch my footing carefully. I didn't see another person for hours. That didn't bother me, though. I liked the solitude. By midday, I reached the ridge. From there, I could see over the trees to rolling hills stretching out in the distance. It was beautiful. I ate one of my protein bars and sat on a rock to rest. A breeze blew through, carrying the smell of pine needles and damp earth. After resting, I continued on. The trail began to wind down the other side of the ridge. That was when things started to feel different. The path was harder to follow. It wasn't marked as clearly, and I had to keep checking the map. The ground was uneven, and in places the dirt had been washed away, leaving slippery patches of rock. I had to go slowly to keep from slipping. At one point, I lost the trail completely. I walked a little too far downhill and realized I wasn't on a path anymore. I stopped, looked around, and didn't see any markers. My stomach tightened a little. I backtracked uphill until I spotted a faint line of packed dirt leading through the trees. That calmed me, but it also reminded me to pay more attention. By the time I reached the river at the bottom of the loop, it was mid-afternoon. The water was low, with smooth rocks exposed along the edges. I filled my bottle with filtered water and sat for a while. The sound of the river was calming. I felt like the hard part of the hike was behind me. All I had to do was follow the river trail back to the parking lot. But as I walked along the river, I started to notice something. The trail seemed less maintained here. Fallen branches blocked parts of the path, and the dirt was uneven. In some places, the path disappeared into tall grass or brush, and I had to guess where it continued. I began to feel uneasy again. The sun was starting to dip lower, and shadows stretched across the ground. I picked up my pace, not wanting to be caught in the woods after dark. I wasn't scared yet, but I felt a growing pressure in my chest. Then I came to a fork I hadn't expected. One path went close to the river, and the other cut uphill through thick trees. The map didn't show two trails there. I paused, trying to decide. The path along the river looked muddy and hard to walk, so I chose the uphill one, thinking it would rejoin the main loop. That was my mistake. The uphill path got steeper and rougher. I kept expecting it to turn back toward the river, but it didn't. After half an hour, I realized I hadn't seen any trail markers at all. I stopped and took out the map, but the area I was in wasn't clear. My hands started to shake a little. I told myself not to panic. I would just retrace my steps. But when I turned around, I realized I couldn't find the spot where I had come from. The trail behind me didn't look the same. Everything blended together: trees, rocks, dirt. I walked back down for a while, but the path grew fainter until it disappeared completely. That was when I felt the first real spike of fear. I was lost. I had been planning a solo hiking trip for weeks. The idea started as a way to clear my head. Work had been stressful, and I had been sitting at a desk far too much, staring at screens and listening to the same background noise of people talking, phones ringing, and emails piling up. I wanted something different. I wanted silence. The kind of silence you only get in the woods, where the only sounds are the wind moving through the trees, birds calling out, or maybe the crack of a branch when something unseen moves in the undergrowth. The area I picked wasn't too far from home, just a few hours' drive into the mountains. It wasn't the most popular trail, which is what made it appealing. I didn't want to be walking a path filled with tourists or groups of people shouting to each other. I wanted something quieter, where I could move at my own pace and feel like I was away from everything. The trail was supposed to loop up through a ridgeline, circle around a valley, and then wind back down near where I started. It was listed as moderate to difficult, which seemed fine. I wasn't an expert hiker, but I had been on enough trails to know what I was capable of. I packed light but carefully. A good backpack, water, snacks, a map, a compass, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, an emergency blanket, and a whistle. I wore sturdy boots I had broken in, not new ones that would tear up my feet. The forecast was clear for the next 2 days, but I still packed a light jacket. I figured it would just be a long day hike. The loop was about 15 miles, so if I started in the morning, I would be back before it got dark. When I arrived, the parking lot was almost empty, just a couple of other cars parked near the trailhead. The sun had just cleared the trees, and the air was cool. I shouldered my pack and started walking, feeling that small rush of excitement you get at the beginning of something you've been planning for weeks. The trail started gently enough. Wide, packed dirt, winding between tall trees with thick ferns growing at the base. It smelled like pine and damp earth, and the air felt fresher than it had in the city. I moved quickly at first, my legs eager to stretch out after the long drive. I kept track of the trail markers, small painted blazes on the trees. Every time I passed one, I felt a little more reassured that I was heading the right way. After about an hour, the trail grew steeper. Roots cut across the dirt, and loose rocks shifted underfoot. I slowed down, careful with each step. Sweat started to bead on my forehead, and I could feel it soaking into the straps of my pack. The sound of birds grew quieter the higher I climbed, replaced by the steady sound of wind moving through thinner, sparser trees. Eventually, the trail broke out onto a ridge. The trees opened, and I could see the valley below, stretching out in layers of green, with darker ridges beyond. For a moment, I just stood there, catching my breath, looking at the view. It was the kind of view that makes you feel small, like everything in your life that felt so big and heavy isn't really that important compared to the scale of the land spread out in front of you. I kept going, the trail narrowing as it followed the ridgeline. On one side, the land dropped sharply, a slope covered in loose rock and thin brush. On the other side, it sloped more gently down into thick trees. The path itself was uneven, broken up by stones and roots. I moved carefully, making sure to place each step solidly. By noon, I stopped to eat. I found a spot where the trail widened and sat down on a flat rock. I ate a sandwich and drank water, the silence pressing in around me. There were no voices, no cars, no hum of electricity, just the wind and the faint rustle of leaves. I should have felt calm, but instead I felt exposed, like being the only person in a wide, empty field. I pushed that thought aside and got back to walking. The trail markers became less frequent as the day went on. At first, I didn't notice. I was focused on the ground, watching where I stepped. But eventually, I realized I hadn't seen a blaze in a while. I stopped and looked around. The trail still seemed clear, though narrower than before. I pulled out my map and tried to match what I saw to the lines on paper. But the map was simple, more of a sketch than a detailed guide. I told myself I was still on track and kept moving. An hour later, doubt started to creep in. The trail looked less like a marked path and more like something made by animals. The dirt was broken up, not smooth from boots, and the brush on the sides pushed in closer. I slowed down, scanning the trees for any sign of paint or a marker. Nothing. I pulled out my compass and checked the direction. According to the map, the loop should have curved back by now, heading toward the valley. Instead, the path kept climbing, pushing deeper into the ridge. I thought about turning back, but the trail behind me looked the same as the trail ahead, and I didn't trust myself to find the exact spot where I might have gone wrong. The thought of backtracking for hours only to end up more lost made my chest tighten. I decided to keep going, hoping the path would reconnect with the loop. The further I went, the rougher it got. Branches hung low, scratching my arms. Loose rocks shifted under my boots, sliding down the slope. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long between the trees. I checked my watch and felt a jolt of panic. It was later than I thought. I pushed faster, but the trail kept twisting, sometimes vanishing into nothing but rock before picking up again. The air grew cooler, and with it came that quiet dread that always comes when daylight starts slipping away in the woods. It's not like in a city where lights come on and people fill the streets. Out here, when the sun drops, the dark is total. By the time I admitted I was lost, it was already too late to make it back down before night. My legs ached, and my throat was dry even though I had been sipping water. I found a small clearing where the ground was flat and decided I had to stop. I hadn't planned to camp, but I had an emergency blanket and enough layers to keep warm. As I set down my pack, I noticed the silence. It wasn't the calm, peaceful kind of silence I had heard earlier in the day. This was heavier, almost pressing. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my own breathing and the faint creak of trees in the wind. That night was long. I tried to rest, sitting against a tree with the blanket pulled around me. Every crack of a branch or rustle in the brush sent a jolt through me. My mind kept imagining shapes in the dark, movement just out of sight. At one point, I thought I heard something heavy moving through the trees, slow and steady. But when I held my breath and listened harder, it faded. I barely slept. When dawn finally came, gray light spreading between the trunks, I felt both relief and exhaustion. I forced myself to eat a little and started moving again. My plan was simple: head downhill. No matter where I was, downhill should eventually lead to water or a road. The slope was brutal. Loose rock, thick brush, and steep drops forced me to zigzag slowly. My legs shook with the effort, and my pack felt heavier with every step. I slipped more than once, scraping my hands on stone, feeling the sting of cuts and dirt grinding into them. Hours passed. The sun climbed high and the air grew hot. I drank more water, watching the supply shrink dangerously low. I hadn't passed a stream or creek, nothing to refill from. At one point, I stumbled into a narrow gully. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and the trees closed in tight above. The air smelled damp, and I thought maybe I would find water there. Instead, I found bones. They were scattered in the leaves, long and bleached white. Some small, like from a deer, but others looked larger. A cracked skull, smooth and weathered, half buried in the dirt. My stomach tightened, and I felt the back of my neck prickle. Could have been from an animal. But the way the bones were spread, it didn't look like a single carcass. It looked like different remains, left in the same place. I didn't stay long. I forced my legs to climb out of the gully, heart hammering, eyes darting at every shadow. By afternoon, I was stumbling. My water was nearly gone, my mouth dry, and my legs sore to the point of shaking. Every noise made me flinch. I kept thinking about the bones, about how easily it would be for me to end up the same way if I didn't find my way out. The terrain grew steeper again, forcing me toward a rocky outcrop. From the top, I could finally see the land stretching below. Forests rolled on for miles, no sign of roads or buildings. But far off, glinting in the sunlight, I saw what looked like a cut through the trees. Straight lines, not natural. Power lines. The sight hit me like a surge of energy. Power lines meant civilization. If I could reach them, I could follow them to a road. Took hours to fight my way down the slope toward them. Branches tore at my clothes. Rocks slipped underfoot, but I kept going. When I finally reached the clearing beneath the lines, I collapsed to my knees, exhausted but relieved. I followed the cut through the woods, pushing forward even as my body screamed to stop. The sun dipped low again, shadows stretching long, but I kept moving. Eventually, I saw a dirt road crossing under. I had been planning the hike for months. It wasn't anything extreme, nothing you'd see in a mountaineering magazine or a survival show. but it was a trail I hadn't done before. It stretched deep into the national forest, running along a series of ridges before dropping into a valley carved by a river that had been cutting the land for centuries. I wanted the quiet more than anything else. Life in town had been noisy and hectic, and I craved a few days of silence. I packed light but carefully. A large backpack with the usual sleeping bag, tent, first aid kit, small stove, food, water bottles, water filter, extra clothes, and a map I had printed from the ranger website. I double-checked everything before I left home. My plan was to hike in for a day and a half, camp near the river, stay a full day, and then hike back. Nothing complicated, nothing dangerous if I stuck to the trail. The first morning was calm. The air was crisp, cooler than I expected, and the forest seemed to stretch endlessly. The path was clear, dirt worn flat from years of boots pressing down on it. I moved slowly, enjoying the rhythm of walking. My legs worked steadily, my breathing easy. The sound of birds followed me through the trees. Every so often, I would stop and take in the silence, letting the forest close around me. The trail wound through pines and oaks, and patches of sunlight broke through the canopy. The ground smelled of damp soil and old leaves. I felt safe, like I was far away from everything but still in control. The kind of control you feel when you're following a plan, when you think nothing can break it. By afternoon, I had covered most of the miles I had planned for the day. I set up camp in a clearing near a small stream. My tent went up smoothly. I boiled water, ate a freeze-dried meal, and sat on a fallen log until the light faded. The forest grew darker slowly, but the change was steady, like a curtain being pulled. When it was time, I crawled into the tent, zipped the bag tight, and fell asleep to the sound of water trickling over rocks. The second morning started just as well. I ate a quick breakfast, packed everything, and continued. The air was heavier, though, as if the forest had thickened overnight. The trees grew closer together, and the light had a dim, filtered look. I told myself it was just the canopy thickening, but the silence felt different, like the birds had moved on. By mid-morning, I reached a fork in the trail. According to my map, I was supposed to keep left, following the ridge before the path would curve down into the valley. The trail marker, however, was missing. A small wooden post stood there, rotted and broken, leaning to one side. The dirt path on the left looked faint, covered in leaves, while the right side was worn deeper, as if more people had gone that way. I stood there longer than I should have. My map clearly showed left, but the right path looked more alive. I convinced myself the map might have been old, that maybe the main route had shifted. Without thinking much more, I followed the right trail. For the first hour, it felt fine. The trail dipped and climbed, weaving through denser trees. The air smelled like pine sap, sharp and sticky. The ground grew rockier, with roots twisting across the dirt. But as I kept walking, something felt wrong. The path narrowed and the ground sloped sharply to one side, pulling me toward a drop hidden by thick brush. I slowed down, checking my footing, feeling sweat gather at the base of my neck. I took out the map again, kneeling on the trail. The lines didn't match anymore. The river should have been below me, but I heard nothing. No sound of rushing water, no hint of a valley opening ahead, just more trees pressing close. I knew I had gone wrong, but instead of turning back immediately, I kept pushing. I told myself the trail would loop down eventually, that I would meet the river if I just stayed steady. That choice was the mistake that carried everything else. By noon, the trail thinned out until it wasn't a trail at all. I was pushing through brush, using my arms to part branches, stepping over loose rocks. My shirt clung to me with sweat. The ground beneath my boots shifted and slid, never stable. I stopped again, heart pounding harder than it should have. I told myself to turn back, but when I turned, I couldn't see where the trail had ended. Everything behind me looked the same: trees, brush, rocks. I retraced a few steps, then a few more, but the ground had no sign of my boots. It was as if I had been swallowed whole. That was the first time I felt real fear. Not the kind that makes you jump when a branch snaps in the night, but the deep, hollow kind that presses into your stomach when you know you're in trouble. I sat on a flat rock and drank water, trying to calm down. My backpack felt heavier now, as if it had doubled in weight. My shirt was damp. I checked my map again, tracing the lines with my finger, but it was useless. The paper showed clean routes and curves, not this mess of trees and slopes. I folded it, shoved it away, and tried to think. I decided to go downhill. Rivers collect in low ground, and if I could find water, I could orient myself again. I tightened the straps on my pack and started down. The slope was steeper than it looked. Loose dirt slipped under my boots, and I had to grab tree trunks to steady myself. Branches scraped my arms. At one point, I slid several feet on my backside, dirt grinding into my pants. The forest grew darker the deeper I went. The air turned still, no breeze moving through the branches. I listened for water, straining, but the silence pressed in. My throat felt dry, though I had just taken a sip. After an hour of steady descent, I finally heard it, the faint sound of water. Relief washed over me. I moved quicker, stumbling, nearly falling several times. When I broke through the brush, I saw it. Not a wide, clean river like I had pictured, but a narrow ravine with a stream rushing hard through it, frothing over jagged rocks. The banks were steep, walls of loose earth and stone dropping down to the water. I crouched near the edge, testing the ground. Pebbles and dirt crumbled under my boots, tumbling into the stream below. There was no way I could climb down without sliding in. I followed the ravine, keeping the water on my right. It twisted and cut sharply, and the banks rose higher. The ground was uneven, forcing me to climb over fallen logs and push through thorny brush. My arms stung with scratches, and sweat burned my eyes. By late afternoon, exhaustion set in. My legs shook with each step, and hunger gnawed at me. I dropped my pack and pulled out a meal, forcing myself to eat even though my stomach felt tight with fear. The forest had grown eerily quiet again. I chewed slowly, each crunch of food sounding loud. When I stood to keep moving, I realized how dark it had grown. The canopy was thick here, blocking the last of the daylight. I knew I had to camp, but the ground sloped too sharply on both sides of the ravine. I pushed on, desperate to find flat land. It was nearly full dark when I found a small patch, a narrow shelf of ground pressed between two large trees. It was uneven, but it was enough. My hands shook as I set up the tent. I kept glancing at the trees, the shadows shifting as the light faded. When I finally crawled inside, zipped the door, and lay in my bag, the silence outside felt crushing. That night was the longest of my life. Couldn't sleep. Every sound seemed amplified. The groan of trees, the crack of a branch, the rush of the stream below. My imagination twisted each noise into something dangerous. My chest stayed tight, my breath shallow. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under, but the sleep was restless, broken by jolts of panic. When morning came, it didn't feel like relief. The light was dim, and the forest seemed heavier. My body ached. I packed quickly and followed the ravine again, but hope had drained from me. I realized the water was running the wrong way. It was flowing deeper into the forest, not toward where the map showed the main river. Following it would only drag me farther away. Panic rose sharp in my chest. I stopped, gripping a tree for balance. The weight of being lost pressed down fully now. I had no trail, no sense of direction, just endless trees in every direction. The next hours blurred together. I climbed, slid, stumbled, forcing my body forward. My water ran low. My food was half gone. My legs throbbed with every step. I tried to mark trees with my knife, shallow cuts in the bark, but everything looked the same after a while. By evening, I reached a point where the ravine split in two. The stream forked sharply, one branch running left, the other right. I stood there, unable to decide. Both directions disappeared into the forest. My chest heaved, sweat dripping from my hair. My body shook not just from exhaustion but from fear. That night, I camped again, though the word didn't fit. I threw the tent up on uneven ground, barely caring if it stood right. My stomach cramped with hunger, but I forced myself to eat. I drank the I always thought of myself as careful when it came to the outdoors. I grew up spending weekends on trails, camping with family, and learning how to handle myself in the woods. I knew how to read a map, how to follow markers, and how to respect the land. That was probably why I felt confident enough to take on a solo hiking trip deep into the gorge country of the mountains in late summer. I wanted the peace, the quiet, and the challenge. I didn't know that trip would end up being one of the scariest experiences of my life, one that I would think about for years every time I packed a bag or laced up my boots. The trail I chose was listed as difficult but manageable for experienced hikers. It cut through rough ridges, steep drops, and thick forest, then wound down into a gorge with a river cutting across sharp rock. The distance wasn't too bad for a 3-day hike. I had food, a lightweight tent, and enough gear to keep myself safe if something went wrong. I had checked the weather ahead of time. 2 clear skies for the next few days with mild temperatures. Everything looked like it was going to be a smooth trip. The first day went exactly how I planned. I parked my car at the trailhead, shouldered my pack, and started down the path. The forest was thick and green, the kind of place where the air smells damp no matter how dry it has been. The ground was soft from old leaves and pine needles. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots and the wind through the trees. By late afternoon, I had reached the edge of the gorge and found a flat area high above the water to set up my tent. I ate, rested, and fell asleep listening to the faint roar of the river echoing up from below. The second day was when things began to unravel. My plan was to descend into the gorge and follow the river downstream before climbing back up to the ridge on the far side. The descent was steep and the trail markers were spaced farther apart than I liked, but I took my time. I used my trekking pole, tested every step, and moved carefully over the loose rock. The deeper I went, the less sunlight made it through the trees. The walls of the gorge rose on both sides like a prison, tall stone cliffs covered in moss and vines. The air grew cooler and heavier. By the time I reached the bottom, the trail had almost disappeared into boulders and roots. The river was beautiful but powerful. The water rushed between jagged rocks, foaming white in places, dark and deep in others. The path followed it closely, sometimes forcing me to step from stone to stone with the water right at my feet. I kept moving, checking my map every so often, though the lines on paper didn't capture how rough the terrain actually was. After a few hours, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a long time. I told myself I was probably just missing them. Maybe they were painted on trees I hadn't noticed. But after another stretch, my stomach tightened. The trail under me was fading into nothing. What had been clear dirt and packed ground became scattered rocks and tangled roots. I backtracked a little, scanning tree trunks and boulders for paint or signs, but there was nothing. That was the first moment I felt real fear. I knew the smart thing was to stop and retrace my steps completely, even if it took hours, but something in me resisted. I thought if I kept going just a little farther, I would see the trail pick up again. The river bent sharply ahead, disappearing around a cliff. I convinced myself the markers had to be just beyond that bend. I pushed forward. The bend led to another, and then another, each one pulling me deeper into the gorge. The ground grew rougher, forcing me to scramble up slick rock and push through brush. My legs were scratched and sore. Sweat ran down my face. Every time I thought about turning back, I told myself it would take longer to retrace than to find the trail ahead. I kept moving forward, ignoring the warning voice in the back of my mind. By late afternoon, the sun was dropping, though I couldn't see much of it between the cliffs. The gorge was already sinking into shadow. I stopped and finally admitted I was lost. I had been following nothing but instinct for hours. I didn't know where the official trail was anymore. My map was useless without markers, and the steep walls of the gorge blocked my compass from being much help. I decided I needed to set up camp before it grew too dark to see. I found a small patch of flat ground away from the water and pitched my tent. My hands shook as I worked, not from the cold but from nerves. I forced myself to eat a small dinner, though every bite tasted dry in my mouth. The sound of the river, once calming, now seemed loud and harsh. When I crawled into my sleeping bag, I lay awake for a long time, listening to the constant rush of water and the creaks of the forest. Every sound seemed closer than it really was. Sometime in the night, I woke to a noise that didn't belong. It was sharp, metallic, like stone knocking against stone. My heart pounded. I held my breath and listened. The noise came again, irregular, not steady like an animal moving. I told myself it could be rocks shifting in the river or a branch falling, but my chest stayed tight. I didn't move until the sounds faded and the gorge went quiet again. Morning brought no comfort. The gorge was filled with mist, and everything was damp. I packed up quickly and tried to make a plan. The only thing I could think of was to follow the river upstream, back the way I had come, until I reached the point where I knew I had been on the real trail. I started moving as early as I could, using every bit of energy to climb over boulders and wade through patches of shallow water. The hours dragged. My shoulders ached from the weight of my pack. My knees hurt from climbing. Worse, I began to realize the gorge didn't look familiar anymore. The turns all blended together. The cliffs looked the same. I couldn't tell if I was retracing my steps or going in circles. By mid-afternoon, I stopped to rest. I sat on a rock, breathing hard, and looked at my map again. The paper was damp and wrinkled. None of the lines matched what I was seeing around me. It felt like the walls of the gorge were closing in tighter every hour. I filled my bottle from the river using my filter and forced myself to drink. I ate a handful of trail mix, then I kept going. As the day stretched on, my sense of direction grew worse. The gorge forked in places where smaller streams joined the main river, and I had no idea which way I had originally come from. Every choice felt like a gamble. I tried following the larger flow, thinking it would lead me back, but nothing looked right. When the sun began to drop again, the fear hit harder. I didn't want to spend another night in that gorge, but I had no choice. I found another flat space, barely big enough for my tent, and set up. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my stove while heating water. I ate in silence, then sat in the fading light, staring at the cliffs around me. That night, the noises came back. Started with rustling, heavy enough that it wasn't just wind. Then came the crunch of stone again, closer this time. I froze inside my sleeping bag, every muscle tense. I didn't unzip the tent or look. I just lay there, heart racing, until exhaustion pulled me under. The third day was worse. My legs were covered in cuts. My pack felt heavier than ever, and I couldn't stop thinking about how far I might be from the trail. My water supply was fine for now, but my food was running low. I tried to keep calm, reminding myself that the gorge had to connect to somewhere, that if I followed the water long enough I'd find an exit. But the gorge didn't feel endless. It felt like a trap. I hiked all morning, slipping, stumbling, catching myself on roots and sharp rock. By midday, the sun overhead barely reached me. My sense of time warped. I couldn't tell if I'd been walking for hours or minutes. And then I saw it. On a boulder near the edge of the river, faint and faded, was a splash of paint. A trail marker. The relief that surged through me was overwhelming. My chest loosened, and I nearly laughed out loud. I dropped my pack, sat down, and let myself breathe for the first time in days. The marker meant I was back near the real trail. All I had to do was follow it. It wasn't easy. The path was overgrown, steep, and rough. But with each marker I found, I grew more certain I was going the right way. I climbed out of the gorge slowly, every muscle screaming, until finally the walls opened up and the trees thinned. When I reached the ridge again and saw the sun fully above me, I felt like I'd been given a second chance. I kept going, mile after mile, until I reached the original trailhead where my car was parked. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring out at the empty lot, shaking from exhaustion and relief. I had made it out. The gorge had swallowed 3 days of my life, but I walked away. And even now, years later, I can still hear the sound of rocks shifting in the dark when I think about it. I had always liked hiking alone. It was one of the few things that gave me peace. The quiet of the woods, the rhythm of my boots pressing into dirt, the sound of leaves moving when wind swept through. It was something I couldn't find in the noise of normal life. That year, I had promised myself to push a little further, to take longer trails, to go deeper into places that didn't get much traffic. Most of the hikes I had done before were popular ones, the kind where you might see a family every few minutes or hear voices echoing somewhere down the path. But the trip I planned that summer was different. It was a loop through a national forest, not a well-known trail, just something I had found on a map after looking at old trip reports from a few years back. The reports weren't many, and that actually made me more excited. I wanted quiet, and I thought I was finally going to get it. The day I left, the air was heavy and warm. The sky was clear, and the forecast showed no rain for at least 3 days, which was perfect because I planned on being out for 2. I parked my car in a small dirt lot at the trailhead, packed my bag onto my back, locked the doors, and started walking. The first few miles were exactly what I wanted. The trail was narrow, a simple strip of dirt surrounded by tall grass and trees that leaned in close, giving me shade from the sun. I passed a creek early on, the water low from the dry summer, but it still trickled just enough to make noise. I filled one of my bottles, filtered it, and kept going. I didn't see anyone, not a single person. That was unusual, but not strange enough to bother me. In fact, I liked it. Every step I took deeper into the woods felt like a step further away from the rest of the world. By the time I had gone 5 miles, the trail started to climb. It wasn't steep at first, just slow and steady, but I felt the weight of my pack pulling on my shoulders. I took breaks when I needed, leaned on a tree, and kept moving. The air grew hotter, sweat ran down my back, and my shirt stuck to me. The dirt under my boots changed to patches of loose rock, which made the climb harder. I slipped a few times but caught myself each time. After about 3 hours, I reached a ridge where the view opened up. I could see tree after tree stretching out in all directions, the forest rolling over hills and valleys like a green ocean. In the distance, I thought I saw another mountain, taller, with cliffs that looked sharp against the sky. I stopped there for a while, sitting on a flat rock, eating a granola bar, drinking water, and letting the breeze cool me off. When I finally stood up again, I noticed something small that unsettled me. On the ground, off the trail, I saw a boot print in the dirt. It wasn't mine. It was pointed in the same direction I was going, but it looked fresh, like maybe only a few hours old. The edges were sharp, not softened by wind or time. I figured maybe a hunter or another hiker had passed through earlier, though it struck me as odd because the lot had been empty when I parked. Still, I didn't think much of it then. I just adjusted my pack and kept walking. The climb grew harder after that. The trail wound back and forth, switchbacks leading me higher, my legs burning with every step. By the time I reached the top, the sun had dipped low enough that I knew I had to start looking for a spot to camp soon. The plan was simple. Make it to a flat area near a creek I had marked on my map, set up my tent, eat, and sleep. The creek wasn't far. The sound of running water reached me before I saw it, and when I did, I felt relieved. The area around it was open, with enough space for me to set up my small tent on soft dirt. I filtered more water, pitched my tent, and started a small stove for dinner. That's when I noticed it again, another boot print. This one was right near the water. It wasn't mine and it wasn't old. I froze for a moment, looking around, scanning the trees, waiting for movement. Nothing. The woods were quiet except for the running creek and the distant sound of insects. The print bothered me more than the first one. If someone was out here, they had either passed the creek recently or were still somewhere nearby. I forced myself to focus on eating, but every noise seemed louder than before. A branch snapping somewhere off in the distance made me look up quick, my heart pounding. I told myself it was probably just an animal. There were plenty of deer around here, raccoons too. When night came, I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and lay in my sleeping bag, listening. Every crack of a stick, every shift of leaves, made me tense. I barely slept, drifting in and out, waking at the slightest sound. The next morning, the woods felt different. The air was cooler, the light dimmer under heavy clouds that had rolled in overnight. I packed up quickly, wanting to put miles behind me. The trail from the creek dropped down into a dense part of forest, darker than the ridgeline had been. The trees were taller here, their branches tangled above me, and the ground was covered in thick moss. Not even a mile from camp, I saw something that made me stop. It was another footprint, pressed deep into a patch of soft earth. But this time, there were more than one. 2, 3, maybe 4, leading off the trail and into the trees. I stood there staring at them, trying to decide if I should follow or keep going. I didn't follow. I didn't want to. I told myself again it was just another hiker, maybe someone scouting off the path, maybe a hunter. But the feeling in my chest was different now. I kept moving faster than before. My pack shifted with each step, the straps cutting into my shoulders, but I didn't care. I just wanted distance. Hours passed. The trail narrowed, overgrown in some places, almost like it hadn't been used much in years. At one point, I nearly lost it when the dirt path faded into grass, and I had to check my map and compass 3 times to be sure I was heading the right way. By the time the sun had started to drop again, I found myself on another ridge, exhausted and sore. I had planned on another night in the woods, but something in me wanted out. I didn't want to stop, didn't want to camp again. I just wanted to reach the loop's end, back to the dirt lot where my car was waiting. I thought if I pushed hard enough, I might even make it before dark. But I didn't. The trail wound down into another valley, thick with brush and uneven ground. My legs were shaking by then, every step painful, but I forced myself forward. The woods grew darker as the sky above turned orange, then red, then gray. It was in that valley that I noticed it again. A branch, broken, lying across the trail. Not unusual, except it looked fresh. The wood pale where it had snapped, the leaves still green. I stepped over it, but when I looked up, I saw movement. Something darting behind a tree, too fast to make out clearly. I froze, every muscle in me locked. My breathing was loud in my ears. Nothing else moved. I told myself it was an animal again, maybe a deer startled by me. But I didn't believe it the way I had before. Not after the footprints. Not after the uneasy feeling that had followed me since the creek. I walked faster. The trail curved through the valley and began to climb again, my legs burning worse than ever. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see someone following. When I finally reached a small clearing, I stopped, bent over, catching my breath. That's when I noticed something that chilled me worse than anything else. On the ground, pressed into the dirt, were 2 sets of footprints, mine and someone else's. The other set followed mine almost exactly, step for step, like someone had been walking the same trail not far behind. My stomach dropped. I turned in a circle, scanning the trees, but the clearing was empty. I didn't camp that night. Couldn't. I kept walking, even as the light faded, even as the trail grew harder to follow in the dark. I used my headlamp, the beam cutting a narrow path through blackness, and I forced myself onward. Every sound felt amplified, the rustle of leaves, the creak of trees, the scurry of small animals. I knew most of it was harmless, but I couldn't shake the thought that some of it wasn't. By midnight, I was stumbling. My legs barely worked. My eyes stung from lack of sleep, and my throat was dry no matter how much water I drank. I finally gave in, found a flat spot off the trail, and set up my tent with shaking hands. I didn't eat. I didn't even change clothes. I just crawled inside, zipped it shut, and lay there, staring into the dark. Sleep didn't come easy. When it did, it came in pieces, broken by sudden jolts awake. At one point, I swore I heard footsteps outside, slow and careful, moving past my tent. I held my breath until my chest hurt, waiting, listening. Then nothing. Silence. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When it did, I packed up and pushed forward again, though my body screamed at me to stop. I didn't care. I wanted out. The trail twisted back toward where I knew the lot had to be. My map said I had less than 5 miles to go. 5 miles felt like forever, but it was the first time I had hope since I'd seen those prints. The woods thinned as I got closer. The trees grew short. I decided to go hiking alone late in the summer, when the heat was starting to fade and the days were still long enough to cover a lot of ground without rushing. I had been planning it for weeks, looking at maps, marking down possible campsites, and making sure I had all the supplies I needed. I had done solo hikes before, but this time I wanted to push myself and go farther than usual, deep into a less popular section of the forest where the trails weren't as clear and where people rarely went. The plan was simple: hike out for 2 days on a loop trail that was listed on an old topographic map, set up camp at a small lake I had read about, and then circle back through a different path. It wasn't supposed to be difficult, just remote. I wanted the quiet, the sense of being away from everything, and the satisfaction of completing it alone. I packed my bag carefully: tent, sleeping bag, extra clothes, food for 3 days, water filter, flashlight, headlamp, batteries, first aid kit, compass, knife, lighter, maps, and a small emergency beacon I carried for safety. My boots were broken in and my gear wasn't new, but it was dependable. When I loaded the car that morning, I felt confident. The trailhead was quiet when I arrived. Only one other car was parked there, dusty and old, maybe belonging to someone else camping in the area. I locked mine, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started walking. At first, the trail was wide and easy. The dirt path was worn down from years of use, the trees on both sides tall and green, with sunlight filtering through in bright patches. The air smelled of pine and earth, and it felt good to breathe it in after so many months of being stuck in the routine of work and city noise. My steps were steady, and my pack shifted against my back with each stride. For the first couple of hours, everything was peaceful. Birds darted across the branches, squirrels rustled in the underbrush, and the occasional breeze moved through the leaves. I followed the map, checking it against the trail markers nailed to the trees. The markers were old, faded in some places, but still there. By midday, I stopped at a small clearing to eat lunch, a simple meal of jerky, nuts, and water. I sat on a fallen log, listening to the quiet. No voices, no traffic, just the sound of wind and insects. It was exactly what I wanted. After resting, I got up, adjusted my straps, and kept going. The trail started to narrow the deeper I went. The brush grew thicker, and the signs of regular use faded. I liked that. It felt like I was really moving into the backcountry. Still, the path was clear enough to follow, and I wasn't worried. As the day stretched on, I noticed something odd. The markers that had been nailed to the trees were less frequent. When I did spot them, some were so faded they were barely visible. My map showed that the trail looped around toward a ridge, then dipped down into a valley where the lake was supposed to be. I trusted the map. It was old, but it had guided me so far. By the time the sun began to lower, I was in dense woods. The trail was harder to see, covered with pine needles and branches. I slowed down to make sure I didn't step off it by mistake. I could feel the weight of the forest now, the silence pressing in. It wasn't threatening, not yet, but it was heavy. I reached the lake just before dusk. It wasn't large, more of a pond really, but it was calm and beautiful. The surface reflected the trees around it, and the air was cool and damp. I set up my tent on a flat spot near the shore, boiled water from the lake through my filter, and cooked a simple meal on my small stove. After eating, I sat by the water until the light was nearly gone, then went to bed. The night was uneventful. I woke once or twice to distant sounds. Maybe animals moving through the trees, but nothing close, nothing alarming. When morning came, the air was crisp, and I felt good. I packed up, made sure the site was clean, and started out again. The second day was when things began to shift. The trail on the far side of the lake was faint. I followed it carefully, scanning for markers. The forest here was thick, branches closing in overhead, the light dimmer even though the sun was high. I walked for hours, checking the compass, glancing at the map, making sure I stayed on track. Around midday, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a long time. I stopped, pulled out the map, and tried to line it up with the terrain. The ridge should have been on my right, but I couldn't see it through the trees. The slope of the ground didn't match what I expected. I told myself it was fine, that I just needed to keep going, and I would find the trail again. I walked slower, scanning every tree for a faded mark, every bend in the path for signs of use. But the farther I went, the less it looked like a trail at all. The ground was uneven, the underbrush thicker. I kept walking, telling myself it was still the path, that maybe it had just grown over. But deep down, I started to feel uneasy. My stomach was tight, and my hands felt damp against the straps of my pack. Finally, I stopped. I dropped the pack, sat on a fallen tree, and admitted it. I had lost the trail. It's one of those moments that feels unreal at first. You think if you just walk a little farther, it'll appear again. But I knew enough about hiking to realize that continuing forward blindly could make it worse. I took out the compass and the map again. If I kept heading west, I should eventually hit the ridge. From there, I could reorient myself. So that's what I did. I strapped the pack back on and pushed through the trees, keeping my eyes on the compass needle. The ground sloped, then rose again, then dipped into a tangle of roots and rocks. It was slow going. Branches scratched at my arms, thorns caught my pants, and every step seemed harder than the last. Hours passed. My legs ached, and sweat ran down my back. The ridge never appeared. I began to doubt the map, doubt my own sense of direction. Everything looked the same: trees, rocks, more trees. By late afternoon, I stopped again, breathing hard. I needed water. I pulled out the filter and drank from a small stream I found, crouching low to scoop the cold water into my bottle. As I filled it, I felt the silence pressing around me. There was no sign of people, no trail, no markers, just endless forest. That night, I set up camp in a small clearing. I cooked a quick meal, but my appetite was gone. The air felt different now, heavier. The noises in the woods seemed louder, closer. Every snap of a branch made me look up. I sat in my tent, flashlight off, listening, waiting for sleep that came slowly and uneasily. The next morning, I tried again. I decided to backtrack, retrace my steps to the lake. But when I started walking, nothing looked familiar. I recognized no fallen logs, no bends in the ground, no landmarks. It was like the forest had shifted overnight. I walked for hours, circling back, trying different directions. My legs burned, and my throat was dry. Each time I thought I recognized something, it led me nowhere. I was lost, truly lost. Panic started to creep in. My breathing came faster, and I had to force myself to slow down. I checked the compass again and again, but it didn't help. North, south, east, west, it all looked the same. I rationed my food, cutting portions in half. I had enough for another day or two if I was careful. Water was less of a problem, since streams were scattered through the area, but finding clean ones slowed me down. The days blurred together. Walk, rest, eat, drink, sleep, wake, walk again. Each morning I hoped to find the trail, a marker, a clearing, something human. Each night I sat in the tent, listening to the sounds outside, wondering how far I had wandered. By the fourth day, I was exhausted. My legs felt like lead, and the skin on my feet was raw from the constant rubbing of wet socks. My clothes were damp from sweat and dew. I was dirty, tired, and scared. That night, I lay in the tent with my eyes open, staring at the fabric above me. I thought about the car sitting at the trailhead, about the world that kept moving while I was stuck here. I thought about how small I was compared to the forest, how easy it was to disappear into it. On the fifth day, I decided to follow the stream. Water always leads somewhere, I told myself. Maybe to a river, maybe to a road. So I walked along it, stumbling over rocks, wading through shallow sections. My pack felt heavier with each step, the straps digging into my shoulders. Hours turned into the whole day. The stream twisted and turned, but never widened, never joined anything larger. I cursed under my breath, but I kept going. That night, I didn't bother setting up the tent. I just laid out the sleeping bag and collapsed onto it. My stomach ached with hunger, and my lips were cracked from thirst. The sixth day was the hardest. My food was gone. My legs trembled with every step. My head pounded. I followed the stream still, forcing one foot in front of the other. I thought about rescue, about someone noticing my car at the trailhead, about search teams fanning out. I never thought one hike could change the way I looked at the outdoors forever. I had been hiking for years, going on trails near where I lived, and even taking longer trips when I had time off work. I liked the quiet, the steady rhythm of walking, and the way the trees and mountains made me feel small but alive. I had always felt like I could handle myself out there. I knew the basics of navigation, I packed carefully, and I stayed aware of the weather. But this trip taught me how fast things can go wrong, and how being alone in the wrong place at the wrong time can push you to the edge. It started out as a plan for a 2-day solo hike through a stretch of forested mountains I had never been to before. The area wasn't completely isolated. There were small towns an hour's drive away, and a few campgrounds scattered along the road that led toward the trailhead. But once you got past the first few miles, it was wild country. The maps showed thick woods, steep ridges, and a river that cut through the valleys. There were no marked campsites past a certain point, and that was part of the appeal for me. I wanted to set up my tent in a quiet spot away from anyone else, listen to the river, and feel like I was in the middle of nowhere. That was the goal. I packed light but careful. Tent, sleeping bag, food for 2 days, water filter, map, compass, extra layers, headlamp, and a first aid kit. My boots were broken in, and I had tested my pack on long day hikes before. The forecast looked clear, cool nights, warm days, no rain in sight. Everything seemed right. I started out early in the morning, parked my car at the trailhead, and signed the little register at the box near the start of the path. The trail climbed steadily for the first few miles, winding through tall pines that blocked most of the sunlight. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots and the occasional bird call. I felt strong, excited, and focused. I had no reason to expect anything other than a good trip. By midday, I had covered more ground than I expected. I stopped at a flat spot near the river, ate a quick lunch, and studied the map. My plan was to follow the river for a while before cutting up toward a ridge where I thought I could find a good place to camp. I wanted to be higher up, both for the view and for the safety from any flooding if the river suddenly swelled. Everything looked good on paper. I packed up and kept walking. As the day wore on, I noticed the trail wasn't as clear as it had been earlier. It narrowed, dipped, and twisted in ways that didn't always match the map. Sometimes I had to stop and look around for trail markers or signs of footprints. I told myself it was fine. I had experience reading terrain, and as long as I stayed aware of the river, I wouldn't lose my sense of direction. But by late afternoon, things started to feel different. The woods grew denser, and the sound of the river became muffled behind thick stands of trees. The ground was damp and uneven, and my pace slowed. The sun was getting low, slanting through the branches, and I realized I was farther behind schedule than I wanted to be. I began looking for a flat spot where I could set up camp before it got too dark. That was when I made my first mistake. I pushed farther than I should have, telling myself I'd find a better place just a little ahead. The map showed an open area near a bend in the river, and I convinced myself it would be perfect. But when I got there, the ground was soggy, littered with fallen branches, and full of mosquitoes. Not a good campsite. The sun was dropping fast, and the shadows grew long between the trees. I didn't want to backtrack, so I pressed on. Finally, I found a small clearing on slightly higher ground. It wasn't perfect, uneven, with roots pushing through the dirt, but I was tired and running out of light. I set up my tent quickly, boiled some water for dinner, and ate in silence while the forest darkened around me. The sound of insects rose, mixing with the distant rush of the river. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, the woods were completely black. I told myself I'd rest, wake up early, and cover more ground tomorrow. But rest didn't come easily. The forest felt different at night. Every small sound carried: branches snapping, leaves rustling, something moving in the underbrush. I reminded myself that animals lived out here, that most of them avoided people, and that I was safe inside my tent. Still, my ears stayed sharp, waiting, listening. At some point I drifted off, but it wasn't deep sleep. It was the kind where you wake every hour, unsure how much time has passed. When dawn came, I felt stiff and groggy. I packed up quickly, wanting to get moving. My plan was to climb toward the ridge and loop back toward the trailhead by the following evening. I thought if I covered enough distance today, I could make it back to my car by sunset tomorrow. That gave me a little comfort. I didn't know how wrong things would go. As I started hiking again, I noticed something strange. The trail I thought I had followed yesterday was harder to find now. I moved in the direction I thought was right, checking the map and compass, but the path under my boots was faint. Sometimes I found old blazes on trees, but they were faded, weathered, and far apart. The forest seemed thicker than before, pressing in on me from every side. By mid-morning, I began to feel uneasy. I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't where I thought I was. The river was quieter, harder to locate, and when I did find it, it didn't match the bends and curves on the map. I sat down, pulled out the map, and tried to match the terrain with what was in front of me. But nothing lined up the way it should. My stomach sank. I realized I might be off the trail completely. At first, I told myself not to panic. I had my compass. I knew the general direction of the trailhead. If I kept heading west, I should intersect the main trail eventually. That was the logic I clung to. I should have stopped, backtracked carefully, and looked for the last clear marker. Instead, I pressed on, convincing myself I'd fix it by moving forward. Hours passed. The sun climbed high, then began to slide down again. The woods grew quieter, as if the animals had gone deeper into hiding. My legs burned, my shoulders ached from the pack, and my throat was dry even though I filtered water at every chance. I felt more and more certain I wasn't anywhere near the trail. Every ridge I climbed showed only more trees, more endless green rolling in every direction. No clearings, no landmarks, nothing familiar. By late afternoon, the unease had turned into fear. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I knew I was lost. I wasn't just a little off the path. I had no real idea where I was. The map was useless now, nothing matched, and the compass only told me directions without meaning. I was deep in the woods, and the trailhead could have been miles away in any direction. I decided to camp again, but this time I chose a spot with more care. I found a patch of dry ground under some tall pines, set up my tent, and gathered extra water before night fell. As darkness came, the fear settled heavier on me. I thought about the register I signed at the trailhead. Someone knew I had gone in, but no one would come looking for at least a day or two. I thought about the small towns an hour's drive away, and how far they felt from where I was now. I thought about how easy it was to vanish in woods like these, how many stories I had read about hikers who never came back. That night was worse than the first. Every sound outside my tent made my skin crawl. I heard movement, heavier than deer, crunching slowly through the brush. At one point, something stopped near my tent, and I held my breath, heart pounding, until it moved away. Sleep came in short bursts, filled with dreams of being chased or trapped. When morning came, I felt hollow, drained, and tense. I knew I had to make a plan. Wandering aimlessly was no longer an option. I told myself to pick a direction and stick with it. West should eventually lead to the road. If I could find higher ground, maybe I'd see a landmark, a ridge, or a clearing. I packed up, tightened my straps, and started walking. The day stretched on endlessly. I moved through thick underbrush, scrambled over fallen logs, and pushed up steep hillsides. Sweat poured down my back, and every muscle screamed. But worse than the pain was the creeping realization that I was making no progress. Every hilltop showed the same view. More forest, more ridges, no sign of human presence. I checked my compass again and again, but it didn't matter. The woods felt like they swallowed direction itself. At some point, I slipped crossing a stream and soaked my boots. The cold water chilled my feet, and I knew blisters would follow. I cursed myself for every mistake, pushing too far the first night, trusting a map that didn't match reality, ignoring signs I was drifting off trail. The forest was punishing me for my arrogance. When evening came, I was too exhausted to think. I set up camp again, forcing myself to eat even though I wasn't hungry. My food supply was limited, and I knew I had to ration, but the thought of going without was worse. The night closed in like a blanket, and I lay awake staring at the roof of the tent, wondering if I would ever see the road again. The next morning, I had been planning the hike for weeks. The idea of going alone didn't scare me because I had done several solo hikes before. This trail, though, was longer than the ones I usually chose. It was supposed to loop through a remote mountain area, with a mixture of steep climbs, thick forest, and open ridges. According to the map, the whole loop was around 30 miles, and most people took 2 or 3 days to complete it. I thought I could finish it in 2 if I pushed myself. I packed enough food, water filters, a small tent, and warm clothes for the chilly nights. I set out early on a cool morning. The sky was clear, and the air smelled fresh like pine and damp soil. My backpack was heavy, but it felt secure against my back. At first, the trail was wide and well-marked. The ground was firm, covered in dry leaves, and I could hear birds calling above me. For the first few miles, everything felt normal, almost peaceful. I kept a steady pace, stopping only to drink water or adjust my straps. By late morning, the trail became narrower. Roots twisted across the dirt like ropes, and I had to watch my step. The trees closed in, blocking some of the sunlight. I was still confident, though. I had studied the map carefully. The loop curved through the forest, climbed up to a ridge, then descended back down to the starting point. There were a couple of streams marked along the way where I planned to refill my water bottles. After about 10 miles, I reached one of those streams. It was shallow but wide, and the water was clear. I crouched to filter some, filling both bottles. The air around the stream was cooler, and there were mosquitoes buzzing in small clouds. I ate a quick snack and pushed on. The trail climbed steeply after that, winding up the mountain. Sweat dripped down my back, and my thighs burned, but I kept going. I wanted to reach the ridge before evening so I could set up camp with a view. The higher I climbed, the quieter it became. The birds seemed to vanish, and the trees grew closer together. At one point, I stopped to rest and noticed how still everything was. No breeze, no animal sounds, just the faint thud of my own heartbeat in my ears. I shook it off and kept moving, telling myself I was just tired. By late afternoon, I finally reached the ridge. The trees thinned, and the trail opened up to a view that stretched for miles. The sky was painted orange and pink by the setting sun. I dropped my pack, breathing hard but relieved. I found a flat spot a little off the trail and set up my tent. As darkness settled, the temperature dropped sharply. I crawled inside, zipped up my sleeping bag, and listened to the faint rustle of wind in the grass. Sleep came slowly, but eventually I drifted off. I woke in the middle of the night. My throat was dry, and my body stiff from the cold. The tent was silent except for the faint sound of fabric shifting in the breeze. I drank some water and lay back down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was too quiet. Normally, even in the mountains, I would hear distant insects or owls. But here, nothing. Just silence pressing against the walls of the tent. Morning came slowly, with a pale blue light filling the sky. I packed up quickly and started down the trail. The descent was supposed to be easier, but the path wound through a dense section of forest that felt almost like a maze. The trees were taller, their branches blocking out much of the sun. The air was damp and cool. The trail was faint in places, covered in fallen leaves and branches. I checked my map often, making sure I stayed on track. Around midday, I realized something wasn't right. The trail markers I had been following seemed to vanish. I walked for half an hour without seeing one. I pulled out the map again, but the thick trees made it difficult to figure out my exact position. I decided to keep moving downhill, reasoning that I would eventually cross a stream or open clearing that could help me orient myself. Hours passed, and my confidence began to crack. The trail was gone now, swallowed by undergrowth. I found myself stepping over logs, pushing through thorny bushes, and trying to avoid soft patches of ground that sucked at my boots. Sweat soaked my shirt, even though the air was cool. I kept telling myself I wasn't lost, but deep down I knew I was. By evening, panic started to creep in. I hadn't seen any familiar markers for most of the day. I set up my tent again, this time on uneven ground between two thick trees. I ate sparingly, realizing I might need to stretch my food longer than planned. Darkness fell quickly in the forest, and I lay awake for hours, listening to faint sounds in the distance. Twigs snapping, something moving slowly through the brush. I told myself it was just deer, but the sound of footsteps circling and stopping made my stomach knot. The next day, I tried to backtrack, but everything looked the same. Trees, rocks, fallen branches. It all blurred together. I climbed a small rise, hoping for a better view, but all I saw were endless waves of forest. My legs ached, and my shoulders throbbed from the heavy pack. I forced myself to keep moving, sipping water carefully and rationing small bites of food. That night was worse. The noises were closer, sharper. Something cracked a branch near my tent, heavy enough that I froze in place, barely breathing. I clutched my knife in my hand, waiting, listening. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. The sound faded eventually, but I didn't sleep again. Days blurred together after that. I wandered in circles without meaning to. Sometimes I thought I recognized a tree or a rock formation, only to realize it wasn't the same. My water filter clogged with dirt, and I had to risk drinking from muddy puddles. My lips cracked, and my stomach cramped from hunger. The forest that had felt so alive on the first day now felt like a trap. By the fifth day, I was weak and stumbling. My food was nearly gone, and my legs barely obeyed me. I thought about just stopping, lying down under the trees, and letting it all end. But some stubborn part of me refused. I pushed forward one step at a time. On the sixth day, I heard something running water. At first, I thought I imagined it, but as I staggered forward, the sound grew louder. I followed it desperately until I broke through a line of trees and saw a stream glinting in the sun. Relief flooded me. I dropped to my knees and drank deeply, ignoring the risk of sickness. The cold water revived me just enough to keep going. I followed the stream, hoping it would lead me somewhere. The forest thinned, and by late afternoon, I stumbled onto a dirt road. My knees buckled, and I nearly cried from relief. I followed the road for what felt like forever until I saw a small wooden sign marking a campground. My legs gave out, and I sat there until a passing hiker found me. I was saved, but the memory of those days has never left me. The endless silence of the forest, the creeping fear of being watched, the gnawing hunger and thirst that made every step harder. It all comes back whenever I think about hiking again. I had wanted an adventure, but what I found was something far different. I had looked at the forest as a place of beauty and peace, but I learned it could just as easily become a place of fear and desperation. I survived, but barely, and I will never again set out on a trail so long, so remote, and so unmarked without preparation that goes beyond maps and gear. I learned that nature doesn't care about plans, and once you're lost, it can strip you down to nothing. The mountains gave me a lesson I will never forget. I had planned the trip for weeks. The map showed a network of trails stretching through a forest preserve I had never visited before. It was farther out than the places I usually went, but I wanted something different. I wanted to push myself a little to get away from the trails that were too well known, the ones crowded with families and joggers. I wanted to be deep in the woods, somewhere quiet, where I could walk all day without seeing another person. I packed the night before. I went over everything twice. Food, water, extra layers, a flashlight, a lighter, a small first aid kit, and my phone. I had a paper map folded into the side pocket of my bag. I checked the weather. It was supposed to be cool but clear, no storms in the forecast. I felt ready. The next morning I left before sunrise. The drive took almost 3 hours. The roads grew smaller the farther I went. First wide highways, then smaller country roads, then finally narrow lanes where the trees leaned close. The parking lot for the trail was nearly empty when I pulled in. Only one other car was there, parked crooked and coated in mud. The air was still when I stepped out. The forest spread in every direction, thick and damp. The trailhead had a wooden sign, faded and cracked. Some of the letters were hard to read. Parts of the map posted there were peeling away, but I could still trace the main loop. I decided to follow the longest path, one that curved deep into the forest before coming back. It would take most of the day, but that was what I wanted. The first hour passed easily. The trail was wide and clear. My boots crunched on the dirt, dry in places and soft in others. Sunlight broke through the canopy in narrow beams. Birds darted between the branches. I breathed in the smell of moss and damp soil. Everything felt calm, but the deeper I went, the less used the trail seemed. Grass pushed up in the center of the path. Fallen branches had not been cleared. I had to step over logs and push through ferns that brushed against my legs. The silence grew heavier. The birdsong thinned out. After 2 hours, I checked the map. According to it, the trail should have forked by then, but I hadn't seen a fork. I kept walking, thinking maybe I had missed a sign, but nothing changed. The trail narrowed more, and the ground sloped upward. My legs started to ache. I stopped to drink some water, listening to the stillness. There was something strange about the silence. I had hiked in quiet places before, but this was different. No birds, no rustle of squirrels, no sound of wind in the trees, just still air pressing against me. I shook it off and kept moving, but the longer it went on, the more it gnawed at me. The trail became rough. Roots clawed up through the soil. Rocks jutted out at sharp angles. I slowed down, focusing on each step. I kept expecting the path to widen again, but it didn't. Instead, it thinned to almost nothing, a faint strip of dirt cutting through thick undergrowth. I checked the map again, but it didn't make sense anymore. According to the paper, I should have been looping back toward the parking lot, but the trail stretched on, straight and narrow. I pulled out my phone. No service. The battery showed more than half, so at least I wasn't running low. I put it back in my pocket and told myself to stay calm. I thought about turning around. It had been hours, but if I followed my steps back, I would eventually reach the main trail. I turned and started walking the way I had come. But after only a few minutes, I realized something was wrong. The trail didn't look the same. The shapes of the trees, the way the ground dipped, the thick brush, it all felt different. I stopped and stared. Maybe I had walked off the path without noticing. I scanned the ground, searching for my boot prints, but the dirt was too hard in places, too soft in others. I crouched, running my hand over the soil. No clear tracks. My chest tightened. I walked back farther, but the trail split in a way I didn't remember. A faint line of dirt veered left, while another pushed forward. I didn't recall either. I stood there for a long time, staring, trying to picture the steps I had taken earlier, but nothing lined up. The air felt heavier. I was sweating even though the temperature was cool. I chose the path to the left and walked faster, hoping it would reconnect with something familiar. The ground sloped downward now. My legs burned as I pushed through thick brush. My backpack caught on branches. Leaves slapped against my face. The trail ended suddenly at a small creek. The water was shallow, trickling over stones. The opposite bank rose steep and muddy. I scanned both sides for signs of a path, but there was nothing, just water cutting through the trees. I thought about trying to cross, but the bank on the other side looked slick and dangerous. I sat down on a rock, pulling my pack off. My water was already half gone. My stomach growled, so I unwrapped one of the granola bars and ate slowly, staring at the trees across the creek. A sound broke the silence then, faint but sharp. A crack, like a branch snapping under weight. My head jerked up. The sound came from the trees beyond the creek. I froze, holding my breath. For a moment there was nothing, then another faint crunch. My eyes scanned the trees, searching for movement. Nothing. The branches stood still, the shadows unmoving. I stayed frozen for what felt like minutes, but the sound stopped. I forced myself to breathe again, telling myself it was probably just a deer. Still, the unease spread through me. I decided not to cross. Instead, I walked along the creek, keeping the water on my right. The ground was uneven, the mud sucking at my boots. Branches tore at my arms. I pushed forward, hoping the creek would lead me somewhere. Maybe a road, maybe a bridge, something. An hour passed, maybe more. The creek twisted and split, breaking into smaller streams that vanished into thickets. I had to choose directions without knowing where they led. My legs ached. Sweat dripped down my neck. I stopped again to drink the last of my water. The forest seemed endless. Every direction looked the same. Trees crowded close, their trunks damp with moss. The sky above was only a thin line of pale light. I felt smaller with every step, as if the forest were pressing in around me. At one point, I thought I heard voices, faint and far away. I stopped, straining to listen, but it faded quickly, swallowed by the stillness. My chest tightened again. I couldn't tell if it had been real or just in my head. My throat grew dry. My legs shook. I told myself to keep moving, but the ground grew harder, steeper. I slipped more than once, catching myself on roots and rocks. Scratches lined my hands and arms. Finally, I reached a clearing. The trees opened into a wide space covered in tall grass. In the center stood a cabin, weathered and leaning. The wood was gray and rotting. The roof sagged. The windows were dark, some broken. I froze at the edge of the clearing. The cabin looked abandoned, but something about it made my skin crawl. I didn't want to go near it, but the sun was sinking, and I had nowhere else to go. I forced myself to walk closer. The porch creaked when I stepped on it. The door hung crooked on its hinges. I pushed it open and the smell of rot hit me. Inside was a single room, empty except for a broken chair and a rusted stove. The floor sagged in places. Holes gaped in the walls where animals had chewed through. I dropped my pack and sat in the corner. My legs throbbed. My throat burned with thirst. The silence inside was worse than outside. Every creak of the wood made my heart jump. Night fell quickly. The cabin grew darker until I couldn't see my own hands. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the black. I sat there, waiting, listening. Every sound felt louder in the dark. A faint scurrying in the walls, the distant crack of a branch. Once, something thudded against the outside wall, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I gripped the flashlight so tight my knuckles ached. I didn't sleep. I sat awake the whole night, eyes fixed on the door. My stomach twisted with hunger. My lips were cracked and dry. When the first light finally came through the broken windows, I forced myself to stand. My legs trembled. I picked up my bag and stepped outside. The air was cool, the forest damp with morning mist. I had no idea which way to go, but I started walking. I avoided the creek this time, choosing a direction at random. I moved slowly, stopping often to rest. My body felt heavier with every step. Hours passed. The sun rose higher, then began to sink again. I stumbled more often, my vision blurring. My water was gone, my food nearly finished. My throat ached so badly it hurt to swallow. Just when I thought I couldn't go any farther, I saw a shape through the trees. A dirt road, faint but real, cutting through the forest. My legs gave out when I reached it. I crawled to the edge and lay there, the rough ground under my hands. After what felt like hours, I heard an engine. A truck rattled down the road, slowing when it I had planned the trip for weeks. The map showed a network of trails stretching through a forest preserve I had never visited before. It was farther out than the places I usually went, but I wanted something different. I wanted to push myself a little to get away from the trails that were too well known, the ones crowded with families and joggers. I wanted to be deep in the woods, somewhere quiet, where I could walk all day without seeing another person. I packed the night before. I went over everything twice. Food, water, extra layers, a flashlight, a lighter, a small first aid kit, and my phone. I had a paper map folded into the side pocket of my bag. I checked the weather. It was supposed to be cool but clear, no storms in the forecast. I felt ready. The next morning I left before sunrise. The drive took almost 3 hours. The roads grew smaller the farther I went. First wide highways, then smaller country roads, then finally narrow lanes where the trees leaned close. The parking lot for the trail was nearly empty when I pulled in. Only one other car was there, parked crooked and coated in mud. The air was still when I stepped out. The forest spread in every direction, thick and damp. The trailhead had a wooden sign, faded and cracked. Some of the letters were hard to read. Parts of the map posted there were peeling away, but I could still trace the main loop. I decided to follow the longest path, one that curved deep into the forest before coming back. It would take most of the day, but that was what I wanted. The first hour passed easily. The trail was wide and clear. My boots crunched on the dirt, dry in places and soft in others. Sunlight broke through the canopy in narrow beams. Birds darted between the branches. I breathed in the smell of moss and damp soil. Everything felt calm, but the deeper I went, the less used the trail seemed. Grass pushed up in the center of the path. Fallen branches had not been cleared. I had to step over logs and push through ferns that brushed against my legs. The silence grew heavier. The birdsong thinned out. After 2 hours, I checked the map. According to it, the trail should have forked by then, but I hadn't seen a fork. I kept walking, thinking maybe I had missed a sign, but nothing changed. The trail narrowed more, and the ground sloped upward. My legs started to ache. I stopped to drink some water, listening to the stillness. There was something strange about the silence. I had hiked in quiet places before, but this was different. No birds, no rustle of squirrels, no sound of wind in the trees, just still air pressing against me. I shook it off and kept moving, but the longer it went on, the more it gnawed at me. The trail became rough. Roots clawed up through the soil. Rocks jutted out at sharp angles. I slowed down, focusing on each step. I kept expecting the path to widen again, but it didn't. Instead, it thinned to almost nothing, a faint strip of dirt cutting through thick undergrowth. I checked the map again, but it didn't make sense anymore. According to the paper, I should have been looping back toward the parking lot, but the trail stretched on, straight and narrow. I pulled out my phone. No service. The battery showed more than half, so at least I wasn't running low. I put it back in my pocket and told myself to stay calm. I thought about turning around. It had been hours, but if I followed my steps back, I would eventually reach the main trail. I turned and started walking the way I had come. But after only a few minutes, I realized something was wrong. The trail didn't look the same. The shapes of the trees, the way the ground dipped, the thick brush, it all felt different. I stopped and stared. Maybe I had walked off the path without noticing. I scanned the ground, searching for my boot prints, but the dirt was too hard in places, too soft in others. I crouched, running my hand over the soil. No clear tracks. My chest tightened. I walked back farther, but the trail split in a way I didn't remember. A faint line of dirt veered left, while another pushed forward. I didn't recall either. I stood there for a long time, staring, trying to picture the steps I had taken earlier, but nothing lined up. The air felt heavier. I was sweating even though the temperature was cool. I chose the path to the left and walked faster, hoping it would reconnect with something familiar. The ground sloped downward now. My legs burned as I pushed through thick brush. My backpack caught on branches. Leaves slapped against my face. The trail ended suddenly at a small creek. The water was shallow, trickling over stones. The opposite bank rose steep and muddy. I scanned both sides for signs of a path, but there was nothing, just water cutting through the trees. I thought about trying to cross, but the bank on the other side looked slick and dangerous. I sat down on a rock, pulling my pack off. My water was already half gone. My stomach growled, so I unwrapped one of the granola bars and ate slowly, staring at the trees across the creek. A sound broke the silence then, faint but sharp, a crack, like a branch snapping under weight. My head jerked up. The sound came from the trees beyond the creek. I froze, holding my breath. For a moment there was nothing, then another faint crunch. My eyes scanned the trees, searching for movement. Nothing. The branches stood still, the shadows unmoving. I stayed frozen for what felt like minutes, but the sound stopped. I forced myself to breathe again, telling myself it was probably just a deer. Still, the unease spread through me. I decided not to cross. Instead, I walked along the creek, keeping the water on my right. The ground was uneven, the mud sucking at my boots. Branches tore at my arms. I pushed forward, hoping the creek would lead me somewhere. Maybe a road, maybe a bridge, something. An hour passed, maybe more. The creek twisted and split, breaking into smaller streams that vanished into thickets. I had to choose directions without knowing where they led. My legs ached. Sweat dripped down my neck. I stopped again to drink the last of my water. The forest seemed endless. Every direction looked the same. Trees crowded close, their trunks damp with moss. The sky above was only a thin line of pale light. I felt smaller with every step, as if the forest were pressing in around me. At one point, I thought I heard voices, faint and far away. I stopped, straining to listen, but it faded quickly, swallowed by the stillness. My chest tightened again. I couldn't tell if it had been real or just in my head. My throat grew dry. My legs shook. I told myself to keep moving, but the ground grew harder, steeper. I slipped more than once, catching myself on roots and rocks. Scratches lined my hands and arms. Finally, I reached a clearing. The trees opened into a wide space covered in tall grass. In the center stood a cabin, weathered and leaning. The wood was gray and rotting. The roof sagged. The windows were dark, some broken. I froze at the edge of the clearing. The cabin looked abandoned, but something about it made my skin crawl. I didn't want to go near it, but the sun was sinking, and I had nowhere else to go. I forced myself to walk closer. The porch creaked when I stepped on it. The door hung crooked on its hinges. I pushed it open and the smell of rot hit me. Inside was a single room, empty except for a broken chair and a rusted stove. The floor sagged in places. Holes gaped in the walls where animals had chewed through. I dropped my pack and sat in the corner. My legs throbbed. My throat burned with thirst. The silence inside was worse than outside. Every creak of the wood made my heart jump. Night fell quickly. The cabin grew darker until I couldn't see my own hands. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the black. I sat there, waiting, listening. Every sound felt louder in the dark. A faint scurrying in the walls, the distant crack of a branch. Once, something thudded against the outside wall, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I gripped the flashlight so tight my knuckles ached. I didn't sleep. I sat awake the whole night, eyes fixed on the door. My stomach twisted with hunger. My lips were cracked and dry. When the first light finally came through the broken windows, I forced myself to stand. My legs trembled. I picked up my bag and stepped outside. The air was cool, the forest damp with morning mist. I had no idea which way to go, but I started walking. I avoided the creek this time, choosing a direction at random. I moved slowly, stopping often to rest. My body felt heavier with every step. Hours passed. The sun rose higher, then began to sink again. I stumbled more often, my vision blurring. My water was gone, my food nearly finished. My throat ached so badly it hurt to swallow. Just when I thought I couldn't go any farther, I saw a shape through the trees. A dirt road, faint but real, cutting through the forest. My legs gave out when I reached it. I crawled to the edge and lay there, the rough ground under my hands. After what felt like hours, I heard an engine. A truck rattled down the road, slowing when it I had been planning the hike for weeks before I actually set out. The idea came to me on a quiet evening while scrolling through maps and trail reviews. I wanted something away from the usual paths, away from crowds, something that would give me the feeling of real wilderness. I had done plenty of weekend hikes before, some of them fairly demanding, but I always stayed near marked areas or on trails that saw regular use. This time I wanted to push further. I picked a route that threaded through forested ridges, down into valleys, then climbed back up again toward a high ridge that overlooked the river basin. It was supposed to be a 2-day loop, with a night spent deep inside the forest where there would be no roads, no cell service, no towns. I loaded my backpack the night before. Tent, sleeping bag, small stove, food, water filter, rain jacket, first aid kit, headlamp, extra socks, knife, lighter, compass, map. I checked everything twice. The pack was heavy, but I felt proud of the preparation. In my mind, I pictured the silence of the trees and the cool air of morning trails. I told myself it would be refreshing, just me and nature, no noise from the outside world. I went to bed with that thought and woke up before sunrise with a knot of excitement. The trailhead was nearly 2 hours from my place. The drive was uneventful, but I noticed how empty the small parking lot was when I finally arrived. Only one other car stood at the far end, dusty and unattended. I stepped out into crisp air, pulled my pack over my shoulders, and locked my vehicle. The gravel lot gave way to a dirt path almost immediately, the forest swallowing me in its shade. The first stretch of trail felt calm. Sunlight filtered through branches in thin lines. The smell of pine was strong, and the ground was soft with needles. My footsteps crunched lightly as I moved uphill. Birds called somewhere far away, and every now and then I heard the scurrying of small animals in the undergrowth. I felt strong, my legs fresh, my pack balanced. The map showed that the first 6 miles were steady climbing, then a sharp descent into a narrow valley where I planned to refill water and stop for lunch. Hours passed in rhythm. Step, breath, glance at map, check compass, repeat. My shirt clung with sweat, but the air stayed cool. Around noon, the trail grew steeper and the switchbacks more frequent. The climb burned my legs, but when I finally reached the crest, the forest opened enough to show a wide view of rolling hills stretching far in every direction. No houses, no roads, no human signs, just endless trees. That sight filled me with a strange mix of awe and unease. The silence felt deeper than I expected. The descent into the valley was harder than the climb. The ground was damp in places, slippery with moss, and I had to slow down, planting my feet carefully. I used a trekking pole for balance, testing each step before shifting my weight. The trail grew narrower, sometimes nearly overgrown. I realized it hadn't been maintained much, though it was still followable. By the time I reached the bottom, the air was cooler, thicker, shaded by towering trees that blocked most sunlight. I could hear the faint trickle of water, and soon I found the creek. I dropped my pack on a flat rock, stretched my shoulders, and knelt to filter water. The creek was shallow but clear, moving swiftly over small stones. I drank deeply and splashed cold water on my face. Then I ate a simple lunch of jerky, trail mix, and a protein bar. The quiet was so complete that even chewing sounded loud. I checked the map again. The plan was to continue along the valley floor, then climb another ridge before evening. I would look for a place to set up camp somewhere up top. I packed away my things, tightened my straps, and started moving again. The valley floor was darker than expected. The trees here were older, thicker, their branches tangled overhead. The ground was uneven with roots and fallen trunks. I moved slowly, careful not to twist an ankle. At one point, I noticed a faint path splitting off to the right, almost hidden under brush. It wasn't on my map. I paused, considered it, then continued straight, reminding myself not to stray. About 2 miles into the valley, I noticed the feeling first. That subtle sense that something was wrong. At first, I couldn't name it. Everything looked the same: trees, ground, shadows. But I began to notice the silence had shifted. There were no bird calls anymore, no rustle of small animals, just the sound of my own boots and breath. It was so complete it pressed on my ears. I told myself it was just the time of day, or that the forest grew thicker here, but the thought didn't settle. The climb out of the valley was rough. The trail turned steep quickly, and I had to use my hands in places, grabbing roots to pull myself upward. My legs ached, sweat stung my eyes. By the time I reached the ridge top, my chest heaved with effort. I dropped my pack, leaned against a tree, and drank water. That was when I noticed something odd. On the trail behind me, not far from where I had just climbed, a small pile of stones stood stacked against the side of the path. 3 flat rocks balanced carefully, one atop the other. It wasn't there when I passed earlier. I was sure of it. I stared at it, heart thudding, trying to explain it away. Maybe I hadn't noticed. Maybe some hiker before me left it. But the trail was nearly overgrown, and the parking lot had been empty except for one car. I pushed the thought aside, hoisted my pack, and kept moving. The ridge stretched on for another mile before it sloped slightly downward into a more open area. Here the trees thinned, and I finally saw a spot that would work for camp. A flat clearing, soft ground, a few logs that could serve as seats. I set down my gear and began unpacking. Setting up camp gave me a sense of routine. Tent first, then sleeping bag unrolled inside, then small stove for boiling water. I ate a hot meal of dehydrated pasta, washed it down with more filtered water, and sat back against a log. The sun dropped slowly. The sky turned shades of orange and then deep blue. The forest grew darker around me until only my small headlamp lit the clearing. That uneasy feeling returned. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the natural nerves of being alone in the woods at night. Still, I kept glancing toward the dark edges of the clearing. At one point, I thought I heard a faint snap of a branch somewhere in the trees, but when I held my breath and listened, there was nothing. I forced myself into the tent, zipped it closed, and lay down. The sleeping bag was warm, the ground beneath firm but manageable. I told myself to relax, to sleep, but my ears kept straining for sounds. Once or twice I thought I heard faint movement, something brushing leaves or a distant step. I lay frozen, gripping the knife I kept near my bag. Eventually exhaustion won, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. I woke in the dark hours of night. My throat was dry, and I reached for my water bottle. That was when I heard it again, definite movement outside. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. Then silence. I held still, every muscle tense. The sound came again, this time closer, circling the edge of the clearing. I wanted to believe it was a deer, maybe a raccoon, but the steps were too heavy, too spaced. They sounded like a person. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, listening, barely breathing. Eventually, the sounds faded. Dawn came at last, pale light seeping through the tent walls. I unzipped the flap with shaking hands and looked out. The clearing looked normal. My gear was undisturbed, but near the path where I had entered, another stack of stones stood. For this time, taller, balanced carefully. Fear pooled cold in my chest. Someone was out here, watching. I packed quickly, stuffing everything into my pack with clumsy hands. I wanted out of the forest. I checked the map, traced the loop that would lead me back to the parking lot, and started moving fast. The trail felt different now. Every shadow seemed deeper, every tree hiding something. I kept glancing behind me, certain I'd see someone following. Once I thought I heard footsteps matching mine, but when I stopped, all I heard was silence. Hours dragged on. The forest seemed endless. My legs ached, but I refused to stop for more than a minute at a time. Mid-afternoon, as I descended toward the lower ridges near the river basin, I came across something that made my stomach twist. In the middle of the path lay a small piece of cloth, torn and dirty, like from a shirt. It wasn't mine. I forced myself to keep moving. I told myself not to panic, but my breathing grew shallow, and my hands shook as I held the trekking pole tighter. I wanted nothing more than to see the parking lot, my car, the open road. The final miles felt like they would never end. I stumbled once, scraping my knee on a rock, but I barely stopped to look. The sun was lowering, shadows growing longer. Then, at last, I caught sight of the gravel through the trees. My chest lifted with hope.